A flight attendant's careless tug on a seatbelt left the CEO's baby screaming in agony, but just 9 minutes later, a sickening crack against the cockpit door would turn the entire cabin into a crime scene. What happened next will leave you speechless. He spilled a baby's blood, never realizing his own fate was minutes away. Subscribe if you believe no one should get away with hurting the innocent. Adrian Holt shifted Cale gently in his arms as the infant stirred, a soft, restless whimper rising above the low murmur of boarding passengers. The cabin air smelled faintly of recycled coolness and fresh coffee, but even in that familiar setting, something felt off. As he stepped past the first-class curtain into the forward aisle, the lead flight attendant, Corbin Latch, stood squarely in his path. "Welcome aboard," Corbin said, his lips curving into a polite smile that stopped just short of his eyes. The words were textbook, but the tone carried an edge, subtle enough that most passengers would miss it, but sharp enough for Adrian to feel it. Adrian gave a courteous nod, adjusting Cale's blanket so the baby's face was sheltered from the chilly airflow. "Thank you," he replied evenly, his voice calm and measured. He moved past, sensing the attendant's gaze linger on him longer than necessary, the kind of look that wasn't about recognition or protocol, but quiet appraisal laced with something less benign. He found his seat by the window, settling Cale into the crook of his arm. The baby let out another small fuss, more out of restlessness than discomfort, and Adrian began rocking him gently. 2 rows behind, Dane Merrick, his trusted executive assistant, was already seated, the leather satchel containing critical negotiation files resting securely under the seat in front of him. Dane glanced toward the front, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked Corbin's movements. The intercom crackled to life with the captain's pre-flight greeting, but Adrian's attention stayed on the way Corbin moved up and down the aisle. There was efficiency in the man's motions, but also a clipped stiffness, each interaction tinged with irritation. When Cale's soft noises drew Corbin's attention again, Adrian caught the faint downturn at the corner of the attendant's mouth. It was the kind of reaction people tried to hide but couldn't quite mask when something, or someone, bothered them. Adrian kept his focus inward, breathing steadily. He had navigated enough boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations to know that small signs often carried big warnings. This was supposed to be a straightforward trip, a critical meeting with the Vandell Infrastructure Council that could secure a decade-long partnership for Halveston Dynamics. He'd left no detail to chance. Dane had the documents, the encrypted drives were ready, and Cale was traveling under special clearance to ensure his comfort and safety. The only unknown factor now was this flight, and the man whose presence seemed to inject unease into the air. As the plane taxied, the faint vibrations through the cabin floor lulled some passengers into quiet conversation while others buckled in for takeoff. Cale shifted again, letting out a brief cry before settling when Adrian adjusted his hold. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Corbin glance their way, the expression on his face unreadable but far from warm. "Something wrong?" Adrian asked mildly, keeping his tone neutral. Corbin blinked as if caught off guard, then gave a dismissive shake of the head. "Not at all, sir," he replied, but the formality felt more like a wall than courtesy. Dane, watching from his seat, caught Adrian's gaze and raised a questioning brow. Adrian offered the smallest shake of his head in return, signaling it wasn't worth engaging, at least not yet. But the sensation in his chest told another story. He knew the rhythm of ordinary travel, the ebb and flow of crew and passenger interactions. This wasn't that. This was something else, something that simmered just beneath the surface. The cabin lighting glowed soft and even, the hum of the engine steady, yet for Adrian, every flicker of movement from Corbin felt like a shadow edging closer. He pressed a light kiss to Cale's temple, feeling the baby's warmth seep into his own skin, grounding him in the moment. Still, his mind worked silently, cataloging each exchange, each sideways glance, the way Corbin's presence seemed to sharpen whenever Cale made a sound. It was subtle, but to Adrian, whose career depended on reading the smallest cues, it was as clear as a gathering storm cloud. And as he fastened Kyle's small lap belt and shifted him into a more comfortable position, that quiet instinct hardened into certainty. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. He didn't know the storm was already seated beside him. Corbin's hand descended without warning, cutting through the space between them like a blade. His fingers closed around the seatbelt clasp with an authority that seemed almost hostile, the sharp scent of his cologne mixing with the stale, pressurized air. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice flat but edged with something colder, something that made Dane, 2 rows back, sit forward slightly in his seat. Adrian paused, Cale shifting restlessly in his lap, the soft sound of his whimper almost lost beneath the steady thrum of the engines. He could have insisted, should have, but a public confrontation would only inflame the situation. He leaned back, his jaw tight, and allowed Corbin to work the belt. The flight attendant's movements were deliberate, almost theatrical. He threaded the strap not across Cale's waist where it belonged, but around the baby's small arm, pulling the length of fabric tight. Adrian's brow furrowed. "That's not—" Before the words could leave his mouth, Corbin's grip changed. His fingers clenched hard on the belt, and with a sudden, violent twist, he pulled. The sound was small but unmistakable, a dull, sickening snap that seemed to echo in the confines of the cabin. Cale's cry tore through the air, sharp and raw, a sound no parent could mistake. His tiny hand flailed, and a thin ribbon of red began to slide down his forearm where the skin had been pinched and torn by the metal clasp. The sight rooted Adrian in place for a fraction of a second, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The hum of the engine seemed to grow louder, pressing in from all sides. Dane was on his feet almost instantly, his voice carrying over the startled murmurs of nearby passengers. "What are you doing? Let go of him!" His steps were quick, his hand half raised as though ready to pull Corbin away. Corbin stepped back smoothly, his face an unreadable mask. "It was an accident," he said, but the chill in his tone stripped the words of any sincerity. His eyes, however, betrayed no panic, only a cold satisfaction, as if daring Adrian to challenge him. Adrian shifted Cale carefully in his arms, his free hand cupping the baby's head while his eyes scanned the injury. The arm was already swelling, the blood staining the sleeve of Cale's pale blue romper. The air smelled faintly of iron now, and each of Cale's gasping sobs felt like a weight on Adrian's chest. Behind Corbin, another crew member, Liam, his nameplate red, hovered at the edge of the aisle. His expression flickered between concern and hesitation, as though an invisible chain held him in place. Adrian met his gaze, silently demanding an explanation, but Liam looked away. The turbulence had settled, but the cabin's stillness now felt different, charged, uneasy. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, some whispering to one another, others pretending to read but unable to keep their eyes from the scene. Adrian's voice, when it came, was steady but carried an edge that cut through the hush. "Get the captain. Now." Corbin didn't move. Instead, a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "The cockpit is off limits during service," he replied, his tone clipped, as if reciting a rule from memory. A businessman in the next row shifted in his seat, his phone angled discreetly toward the aisle. Adrian caught the faint glint of the lens and understood. Evidence. Without it, Corbin's denial could erase the truth before they even touched the ground. Dane stepped closer, his voice lowered but urgent. "We need to document everything. Right now." Adrian nodded almost imperceptibly, but his eyes never left Corbin. He could feel the heat of his own pulse in his temples, the conflicting pull between wanting to stand and confront the man and knowing that Cale's safety had to come first. Every instinct told him this wasn't over, that the violence he had just seen was not a careless mistake, but a deliberate act. The seconds stretched, the sounds of the cabin narrowing to Cale's uneven breaths and the low murmur of the engines. Adrian felt something shift inside him, a line crossed without warning or return. This flight was no longer about reaching Vandal City or securing a business deal. It was about control, about truth, and about making sure Corbin never had the chance to harm anyone else. That, Adrian thought as he adjusted Cale's blanket and met Corbin's gaze head-on, was the moment the flight's true descent began. Panic rippled through the nearby passengers the instant Cale's scream cut through the steady hum of the engines. Heads turned, conversations halted, and a few startled gasps broke the uneasy quiet of the cabin. Dane shot up from his seat 2 rows back, his hands gripping the headrest in front of him as he pushed into the aisle. His voice was sharp, controlled, but edged with alarm. "Let go of him now," he demanded, striding forward. Corbin stepped back a half pace, not in retreat, but in calculated withdrawal. His expression carried no hint of remorse. Instead, there was a detached indifference, almost as if he were evaluating a problem he could easily explain away. "It was an accident," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear. The words rolled off his tongue smoothly, but his eyes, cold, steady, and unflinching, told a different story. There was no flicker of concern for the baby's pain, no acknowledgement of the harm he had caused, only a guarded challenge that dared anyone to contradict him. Adrian held Cale close, pressing the baby's trembling body against his chest. His gaze dropped to the small, fragile arm, twisted unnaturally and already swelling beneath the blood-soaked sleeve. The thin fabric clung to the child's skin where it was torn, a dark crimson patch spreading slowly but steadily. The sight made Adrian's breath tighten. He brushed his thumb gently along Cale's cheek, murmuring soft reassurances, though his voice felt hollow against the storm building inside him. From the aisle, Liam Roach, another member of the cabin crew, hesitated. His steps were slow, his eyes darting between Adrian and Corbin. There was a strain in his posture, a visible pull between instinct and self-preservation. "Is everything all right here?" Liam asked, though the question sounded more like a plea for the scene to resolve without his involvement. Adrian's head snapped toward him. "Get the captain," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Now." Liam's lips parted, but before he could answer, Corbin interjected with a faint smirk. "The cockpit is off limits during service," he said smoothly, clasping his hands behind his back. The way he delivered the line felt rehearsed, like a rule he had invoked before to shut down an inconvenient request. A man in a navy suit seated across the aisle shifted slightly, angling his phone low in his lap. His camera lens caught the light briefly before disappearing beneath the shadow of the seatback. The businessman's movements were small, practiced, someone who knew how to record without drawing attention. Dane stepped closer to Adrian, lowering his voice to a whisper. "We need to lock this down before he spins it," he said, his eyes flicking toward Corbin, who was now scanning the cabin as if measuring how much of the audience was on his side. "If we wait, he'll twist the story before we land." Cale's cries rose again, a wavering, desperate sound that seemed to fill every corner of the cabin. Passengers fidgeted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or look away. Adrian's grip tightened on his son. The sound cut into him deeper than any insult could have, each sob a reminder of the harm already done. Corbin's face remained impassive, but the faint lift at the corner of his mouth betrayed something almost like satisfaction. The businessman's camera caught it, a flash of expression so brief it might be missed by anyone not looking for it. Adrian glanced down the aisle, mentally cataloging every potential ally, every witness. His mind was no longer on the meeting in Vandell City, nor the deal that had brought him onto this flight. The stakes had shifted entirely. His focus sharpened into something colder, more deliberate. The objective was no longer just to soothe his child. It was to ensure that this moment would not vanish into an airline's report filed under minor incident. Dane's hand rested briefly on Adrian's shoulder, a quiet signal of solidarity. The hum of the engines was steady, but underneath it, the cabin carried a subtle vibration, not from turbulence but from the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Passengers stole glances between the men, sensing that this was no ordinary disagreement. Every heartbeat seemed to stretch longer, the space between seconds filled with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. Somewhere in the back of Adrian's mind, a thought settled like stone. There would be no forgiveness without justice. The businessman's phone tilted slightly, its recording light hidden beneath his thumb. Dane gave a subtle nod, silently acknowledging that their first piece of evidence was secure. Corbin, however, seemed unconcerned, as if confident the chain of command would shield him. That confidence only deepened Adrian's resolve. The baby shifted against Adrian's chest, his small hand brushing weakly at his father's collar. The motion was instinctive, but it made Adrian's throat tighten. The injury wasn't just physical, it was a violation of safety, of trust, of the unspoken rule that children are beyond harm in such a space. In that instant, something within Adrian settled into place. This was no longer about a business deal, this was war at 30,000 feet. Corbin's voice cut through the low hum of the cabin like a jagged blade, sharp and deliberate. He had stepped just far enough into the aisle to make himself visible to half the passengers, his words carrying a practiced rhythm that sounded official to the unknowing ear. "We have an aggressive, entitled traveler here, folks," he announced, gesturing toward Adrian with a casual flick of his wrist as if the accusation were as plain as the seat numbers overhead. The calculated ease in his tone made the insult land heavier, a performance designed to spread suspicion like spilled ink. Adrian's jaw tightened, his arm instinctively drawing Cale closer. He could feel the rise and fall of his son's small chest against him, each shaky breath feeding the fire already building in his own. Outwardly, he forced calm into his posture, straight back, steady breathing, but his mind was already tracking the faces around them. Some passengers glanced up from their books and tablets, brows knit in mild concern. Others leaned subtly into the aisle. Curiosity sparked, but loyalty unclaimed. This was the moment Corbin wanted, the seed of doubt planted before anyone heard Adrian's side. A few rows back, Dane Merrick's hands moved with quiet precision. Shielded by the angle of his seat, he unlocked his phone and tapped out a message to a single contact in Vandal City's security bureau. No unnecessary words, just a blurred image of Cale's injured arm, the blood-stained sleeve, and the short code phrase they had agreed upon years ago for emergencies. Once sent, he lowered the phone to his lap, eyes flicking up to gauge Corbin's reach. Corbin's voice rose a notch, playing to the row behind him now. "We're all trying to have a safe flight here, and some people think they're above following crew instructions." His lips curled in the faintest smirk as if he were savoring each syllable. It was a performance dressed in authority, designed to make any challenge sound unreasonable. Adrian said nothing, not yet. Instead, he turned his head just enough to lock eyes with Dane. A silent agreement passed between them, sharpened by years of shared crises. Dane rose casually, leaning toward a young man across the aisle, a passenger who had watched everything with quiet, furrowed focus since the injury. With practiced discretion, Dane tilted his phone, showing the man a snippet of the recording. Corbin's hands twisting the seatbelt, the flash of Cale's startled face, the snap that still echoed in Adrian's ears. The man's jaw set, his nod slow but certain. He whispered something to the woman beside him, and soon another passenger leaned forward to see. The murmurs shifted. What had been a scatter of uncertain whispers began to ripple with the undertone of shared understanding. Corbin noticed. His shoulders stiffened, and for the first time since the incident, his eyes flickered, not with anger, but with the faintest trace of unease. Liam Roche appeared in the narrow aisle, moving as if on routine duty. His tray was empty, his expression neutral, but when he passed Adrian's row, he bent slightly. "You're not the first," he murmured, his voice pitched so low that only Adrian could hear. For a moment, the hum of the engines seemed to fade, replaced by the weight of those 4 words. Adrian's eyes followed Liam as he walked on, replaying the phrase. It wasn't just a statement, it was confirmation. Whatever had just happened to Cale was not an isolated act of cruelty but part of something larger, an undercurrent woven into the crew's culture. The realization settled in like a stone in his chest. Corbin, unaware of exactly what Liam had said but sensing his control slipping, quickened his pace down the aisle, speaking louder now, almost overcompensating. "We'll be handling this professionally," he declared, his voice tight. "No one needs to get involved." But the attempt rang hollow, the edges fraying as more passengers leaned toward Dane's phone or whispered among themselves. Adrian inhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. His objective crystallized with brutal clarity: protect Cale, hold Corbin accountable, and ensure the truth was anchored so deeply it could not be uprooted. He knew this was no longer a simple confrontation. This was the opening of a deeper battle, one that would demand precision, patience, and unshakable resolve. The moment held, a fragile balance between escalation and control. And as Adrian shifted Cale in his arms, he felt the division in the cabin solidify, invisible lines drawn between those who had seen enough to believe and those still adrift in doubt. The cabin was divided, but the battle lines were sharpening with each passing minute. Corbin's sudden lunge was so quick that the passengers in the nearest rows barely had time to register what they were seeing. One moment, Adrian was striding toward the cockpit door, his jaw set with quiet determination, Cale held securely in the crook of his arm. The next, Corbin stepped into the aisle like a barricade, his shoulders squared, the narrow space amplifying his imposing presence. "You take one more step," Corbin hissed, leaning in so close that Adrian could feel the heat of his breath, "and I'll make sure you land in handcuffs." The words hung in the air, cold and venomous. Adrian's eyes met his with unflinching steadiness. Behind that calm, his mind churned, calculating the weight of every insult, every act of cruelty since boarding. Cale stirred faintly in his arm, a soft whimper escaping, and the sound made Adrian's resolve tighten like a clenched fist. Behind him, Dane's expression had sharpened into something colder than shock. Without saying a word, he shifted his shoulder bag onto his lap, the movement deliberate and practiced. His fingers slipped inside, closing around the small portable hard drive they carried for sensitive negotiations. If anyone seized their devices, the most crucial evidence, the video files of Cale's injury, would survive. "Step aside," Adrian said, his voice level, almost too calm. It wasn't a plea, it was an order cloaked in restraint. Corbin's smirk deepened, feeding on the tension in the air. "You're not in charge here," he sneered, his voice pitched just loud enough for nearby passengers to catch. "You want to make a scene? Go ahead, everyone's watching." The hum of the engines seemed to fade, replaced by the steady pulse in Adrian's ears. He could sense the eyes on them, the curious, the concerned, the ones unsure whom to believe. That was Corbin's weapon, perception. If he could paint Adrian as aggressive, the truth would be buried before they touched the ground. Dane's hand tightened on the drive. He caught Adrian's gaze for a fleeting second, his eyes saying what words didn't dare. "We can't afford a misstep." And then Corbin acted. With a sudden, calculated shove, he slammed both palms into Adrian's chest and shoulder, driving him hard into the bulkhead beside the cockpit door. The impact sent a dull thud through the narrow space. The metal was cold against Adrian's back, and the edge of the panel bit into his shoulder, making Cale flinch and cry out in protest. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. Someone muttered, "Hey, that's enough!" But no one moved fast enough to intervene. Adrian's free hand shot out, bracing against the wall to steady himself. Cale's cries sharpened, the sound twisting the air with urgency. For an instant, Adrian's mind narrowed to a single thought. Protect him. Everything else, the stares, the whispers, the looming presence of Corbin, blurred into background noise. He drew Kyle closer to his chest, his thumb brushing gently over the baby's head in a silent promise. Corbin loomed, his posture screaming triumph, as if daring Adrian to retaliate and prove his own accusations. The aisle felt suffocating, every inch thick with unspoken threats. Dane rose halfway from his seat, his voice low and controlled. "You should step back," he warned, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone ready to act. But Corbin only shifted his weight forward, as though claiming the space around the cockpit as his own territory. "Make one wrong move," he murmured, "and you'll regret it." The cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane adjusted altitude, the momentary dimness wrapping the Confrontation in shadow. Adrian's eyes, steady and unreadable, held Corbin's without blinking. Inside, however, the balance had tipped. This wasn't just about endurance anymore, it was about ending this. The image of Cale's injury, the blood staining his sleeve, burned like a brand in Adrian's mind. Dane's fingers moved subtly over the drive, ready to secure it in case things turned violent again. The hard drive felt like their lifeline, proof that couldn't be silenced. Adrian straightened slowly, his voice steady but edged with steel. "This ends now." The faintest trace of uncertainty flickered in Corbin's eyes, quickly masked by arrogance. But Adrian saw it, and he knew. In that heartbeat, his decision crystallized. Corbin would not leave this flight unscathed, physically or legally. One way or another he will answer for this. The countdown to his reckoning had already begun. Corbin's voice cut through the low hum of the engines like a blade. "Fragile," he said, drawing the word out with a smirk that barely touched his lips. "Dramatic." The taunt hung in the air, sharp enough to make a few nearby passengers glance up from their magazines and screens. Adrian didn't flinch. His hands tightened instinctively around Cale, whose uneven breathing brushed faint warmth against his father's chest. The ache in his shoulder from earlier was a dull reminder of just how quickly this man could escalate. Still, Adrian's eyes were steady, his voice measured, calm in a way that only made the insult feel more hollow. "Every second of your behavior," Adrian said, his tone even, "is being documented." Dane stood just behind him, the phone in his hand held low but angled perfectly to catch both men in the frame. His expression was neutral, almost disinterested to anyone who didn't know him, but Adrian could read the focus in his eyes. Every muscle in Dane's shoulders was drawn tight, ready to react. A soft shuffle of movement broke through the tension. A passenger 2 rows away leaned into the aisle, slipping a small folded slip of paper toward Adrian with a hesitant hand. Adrian took it without looking down, sliding it into his palm. The paper felt warm, slightly crumpled, the ink faintly smudged from the man's thumb. Inside, a name and number were scrawled quickly, proof that another set of eyes, and another camera, had captured the moment Corbin twisted Cale's arm. Corbin's gaze flicked to the exchange, suspicion flashing briefly before it twisted into something darker, a thin, calculated smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think gathering little scraps of paper will help you?" he muttered under his breath, low enough for only Adrian to hear. Adrian didn't respond. He let the silence work, the kind of silence that made people fill it with their own unease. Corbin shifted his weight, glancing toward the forward galley, then back to Adrian, as though assessing the angles in some private calculation. The plane's lighting flickered briefly as it adjusted to the dimmed cabin mode, shadows sharpening the lines of Corbin's jaw and making his expression seem harsher, more closed off. Behind them, the businessman who had given Adrian the paper leaned back in his seat, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his camera lens caught the reflection of the scene in the glossy surface of the seat back ahead. Every witness mattered now. Every detail counted. Dane's voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. Stay with him. Let him make the mistake. His eyes never left Corbin. Adrian gave the faintest nod. His breathing was controlled, but his mind raced through possibilities. What would be enough to trigger Corbin without putting Cale at further risk? He knew from experience that a man like this, so certain in his untouchable position, would overreach if pushed just enough. Corbin took the bait without realizing it. Stepping closer, he invaded Adrian's space, his posture loose but his eyes sharp, like a predator deciding how much longer to toy with its prey. "You're not in control here," he said softly, his breath carrying the faint scent of stale coffee. "I am." Adrian let the words settle, let them bounce off his calm exterior. But inside, he marked the shift. Corbin had moved closer, just within reach of Dane's camera. "You've already crossed a line," Adrian replied, his voice still steady, "and every passenger here knows it." A flicker of irritation broke through Corbin's smirk, the kind of crack that came just before someone stopped thinking and started acting. And then it happened, suddenly, decisively. Corbin's hand darted forward, fingers curling, aiming not for Adrian, but for Cale. The movement was fast enough to startle the nearest passenger into a sharp intake of breath. In that fraction of a second, Dane moved. He stepped directly into Corbin's path, his body blocking the reach, his stance deliberate and unyielding. The aisle narrowed instantly between them. The hum of the engines muffled under the thick silence that followed. Corbin's hand hung in the air for a moment before he slowly pulled it back, his face tightening in a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Adrian's eyes locked on Corbin's, unblinking. He could feel the weight of every watching gaze, the way the air in the cabin had shifted. The plan had worked. Corbin had revealed himself without Adrian having to do more than hold his ground. The seconds stretched, each one measured by the thud of Adrian's heartbeat in his ears, until Corbin finally stepped back, jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the two men as though trying to decide his next move. Dane didn't break his stance, didn't lower the phone. The evidence was secure. The passengers had seen. Adrian adjusted Cale in his arms, the baby stirring but not waking fully. His mind was already moving to the next step, but his focus stayed locked on Corbin, reading the man's every twitch, every breath. The balance of the encounter had shifted, and everyone in the aisle seemed to sense it. The moment for subtlety was almost over. Corbin's hand shot out like a striking snake, his fingers clamping down on Adrian's shoulder with bruising force before shoving him hard into the cold, unyielding surface of the cockpit door. The impact reverberated through Adrian's frame, the metallic thud swallowed only by the steady roar of the engines. Gasps rippled from nearby passengers, their eyes flicking between the Confrontation and the aisle, unsure whether to intervene or shrink back. Corbin loomed closer, his breath quick and shallow, a thin sheen of sweat glistening at his temple, not from fear, but from the rush of dominance he thought he held. Liam Roach, standing just behind Corbin, hesitated only for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. He glanced around quickly, ensuring no one was watching too closely, and slid a small laminated card into Adrian's palm with practiced subtlety. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but each word carried urgency. "You'll need this soon." His eyes darted nervously toward Corbin, as though expecting retaliation for even this small act of defiance. Then he turned away, his shoulders rigid, retreating back toward the galley as if nothing had happened. Adrian curled his fingers around the card, the smooth plastic warming quickly in his grip. His gaze fell briefly to the printed numbers and symbols, a direct emergency code to the cockpit, something passengers were never supposed to have. A lifeline. hidden in plain sight. His mind was already working, weighing the possibilities, the risks, the timing. But before he could even take a step toward the narrow wall panel where the call system was embedded, Corbin struck again. With sudden aggression, Corbin's hand clamped onto Adrian's shoulder once more, fingers digging in as he jerked him back from the door. The motion was deliberate, meant to both intimidate and humiliate. This time, Adrian did not absorb the blow in silence. The sting of the earlier impact still radiated through his bones, but beneath it was something sharper, a calm, cold clarity that overrode the heat of anger. "Step back," Adrian said evenly, his voice pitched low enough to command attention but not draw panic. His eyes locked on Corbin's, unblinking. The attendant smirked, the corners of his mouth twisting into a challenge. "Or what?" he asked, leaning forward, his tone mocking, as if daring Adrian to react in front of the entire cabin. Dane Merrick, 2 rows back, had already shifted Cale into the crook of one arm, freeing his other hand to grip the seat in front of him. His expression was tight, calculating, his gaze flicking between Adrian and Corbin, ready to move if the situation turned violent. Around them, whispers filled the air, passengers sensing that the quiet hostility was edging towards something explosive. Adrian took a single step forward, angling his body slightly so that the laminated card remained hidden from view. The hum of the engines felt louder now, a constant vibration underfoot that mirrored the tension winding through his muscles. Years ago, he had been trained in self-defense, not for show, but for moments exactly like this, when waiting for someone else to act could mean losing control entirely. He could feel that training returning now, unbidden yet precise. Corbin's eyes narrowed, his smirk hardening into a glare. He shoved Adrian again, harder this time, pressing him against the reinforced door as if to remind him who controlled access to the captain. But instead of yielding, Adrian shifted his stance, his weight balanced, one arm instinctively moving to shield Cale's space, though the baby was now safe in Dane's hold. The attendant didn't notice the subtle change in posture. He was too focused on asserting dominance. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The low murmur of conversation had vanished, replaced by the faint hiss of circulated air and the distant clink of cutlery from the galley. Even the overhead lights felt harsher, casting sharp lines across the scene. Dane's eyes met Adrian's briefly, and in that instant, both understood the next move would decide everything. Adrian exhaled slowly, his heartbeat steady despite the coiled tension in his chest. Every calculation ran through his mind: the confined space, the proximity to the cockpit, the watching passengers, the potential for Corbin to twist the story if things escalated too soon. But he also knew that letting this stand would embolden the man to push further. He straightened, subtly rolling his shoulder free from Corbin's grip, the movement deliberate and controlled. His voice, when he spoke again, carried no tremor. "I'm not moving away from this door," he said, each word deliberate, the quiet conviction more threatening than a raised voice could ever be. Corbin's jaw flexed, his hand hovering as if deciding whether to grab him again. The smirk returned, smaller this time, but sharper, laced with the arrogance of someone convinced of his invincibility. He leaned in just enough for Adrian to catch the faint scent of stale coffee on his breath. Adrian didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch, the weight of his unwavering gaze pressing back against Corbin's posturing. He could feel Dane edging closer, positioning himself so that if the attendant lunged, Cale would remain untouched. Somewhere toward the rear of the plane, a passenger cleared his throat, a small sound that seemed almost unnaturally loud in the heavy quiet. The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Adrian knew the next few seconds would tip the balance, either into resolution or into a confrontation neither could walk away from unchanged. He shifted his stance once more, the card still hidden in his palm, the engine's low drone vibrating through his feet, every sense sharpened to a fine point. With Cale secured in Dane's arms, Adrian twisted free, his training from years ago in self-defense surfacing instinctively. He positioned himself between Corbin and the cockpit, the hum of the engines mixing with the rising whispers in the cabin. The point of no return had arrived. He shattered a baby's arm and smiled, thinking there'd be no reckoning. If you believe cruelty like this must be met with justice, hit subscribe now. This story will not be silenced. Corbin's hand shot forward, fast and deliberate, his fingers stretching toward Adrian's shoulder like a striking snake. In that instant, the cabin seemed to narrow, the hum of the engines fading beneath the pounding rhythm of Adrian's heartbeat. The space between them was tight, barely a few feet, but every inch felt charged, dangerous. Adrian's mind sharpened to a single point. He had studied the angles, calculated the timing, and now the opening had presented itself. Adrian's muscles reacted before conscious thought could intervene. He shifted his weight to his back foot, sidestepped just enough to make Corbin's lunge overextend, and with a controlled grip, hooked his arm under the attendant's. The motion was fluid yet unyielding, an economy of force honed from the quiet discipline of self-defense training long buried beneath years of boardrooms and negotiations. Corbin's momentum became his undoing. The attendant's body twisted awkwardly, his balance gone in an instant. Adrian guided, not shoved, him toward the solid frame of the cockpit door, the reinforced metal looming like the unmovable wall it was. There was no time for Corbin to brace himself. His neck struck the edge with a sharp, resonant crack that sliced through the murmurs in the cabin. Silence followed. A deep, thick silence, broken only by Corbin's ragged gasp as his knees buckled. The arrogance that had laced his grin moments before drained away, replaced by the stunned vacancy of someone realizing they were no longer in control. His hands fluttered uselessly near his throat, one palm bracing against the doorframe as if it could anchor him. Adrian didn't move to press the advantage, nor did he look away. His posture was steady, his breathing measured. Inside, his focus remained locked on the two most important things, Cale's safety and the undeniable evidence of Corbin's aggression. This wasn't about revenge in the heat of the moment. It was about ending the threat, decisively and beyond dispute. "Adrian!" Dane's voice was low but urgent as he stepped in, placing his own body between Cale and the fallen attendant. The baby, startled by the sudden movement, whimpered softly against Adrian's chest before settling under Dane's steady hands. Dane's eyes met Adrian's for the briefest second. No panic, just a silent confirmation that Cale was secure. Liam hesitated on the edge of the scene, his expression torn between loyalty to his crew and the undeniable truth of what he'd witnessed. His gaze flicked to Corbin, then to Adrian, and finally to the cockpit door as if weighing whether to summon the captain. The tension in his jaw betrayed the fear that still held him back. Around them, passengers watched in uneasy silence. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, while others pretended to busy themselves with seatbelt buckles and window shades, unwilling to be drawn into the conflict. A businessman 2 rows back angled his phone discreetly, recording even now. Every lens, every stare, felt like it was capturing the moment for a courtroom that existed both in law and in the court of public opinion. Corbin coughed once, the sound brittle and hoarse, his earlier defiance nowhere to be found. He tried to straighten, but his body betrayed him, listing slightly to one side. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came, only another rasp of breath. Adrian took one slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the attendants. There was no rush, no need to raise his voice. The moment spoke for itself. The air between them was thick with an unspoken truth, that this was the end of Corbin's unchecked hostility, and everyone in that cabin knew it. "This is the last harm you'll ever cause." The cockpit door swung open with a sharp metallic click, the narrow aisle suddenly framed by the tall figure of Captain Joran Fisk. His posture was rigid, his expression carved in stone as his eyes moved slowly across the scene, the injured attendant clutching his neck, the tight clusters of passengers whispering in shock, and Adrian Holt standing unmoving, Cale cradled protectively in his arms. The low hum of the engines seemed louder in the tense silence, every vibration of the aircraft carrying the weight of what had just happened. Corbin moved first, his voice strained but urgent. "Captain, he coughed mid-sentence, pressing a hand harder against his neck as if the pain might buy him sympathy. "He attacked me, out of nowhere, completely unprovoked." His tone wavered between righteous indignation and desperate self-preservation, his eyes darting toward the other crew members as though seeking an ally. Captain Fisk didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted to Adrian, who met it evenly. There was no plea for understanding in Adrian's expression, only an unyielding calm, as though he was already certain of the truth's weight. Dane Merrick stepped forward from his position behind Adrian, his movements deliberate. In his hand, he held the portable hard drive, sleek, metallic, and heavier than its size suggested, not just in weight, but in consequence. Without ceremony, Dane extended it toward the captain. "You should see this before you decide anything," he said, his voice low but edged with conviction. Fisk accepted the device, inserting it into a small port on a tablet he withdrew from a compartment above the jump seat. The captain's brow furrowed as he navigated to the first file, the faint reflection of the screen flickering across his features. The cabin remained utterly still. Even the passengers seemed to hold their breath, craning to catch any sign of his reaction. The footage began. Cale's small arm, Corbin's hands gripping the seatbelt, the sudden, violent twist. The sound of the snap was tinny through the tablet's speakers but still unmistakable, followed by the baby's piercing cry and the immediate bloom of red against the fabric of his sleeve. Fisk's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin, unreadable line. He let the footage run for a few seconds longer before stopping it abruptly. His gaze rose to Corbin, and in that moment, the air seemed to shift. The subtle undercurrent of uncertainty in the cabin turned into a palpable current of judgment. "Liam," the captain said, his voice level but carrying the kind of authority that left no room for hesitation. "Escort Mr. Latch to the galley. Secure him there until we land. He is not to interact with any passenger for the remainder of this flight." Liam Roach, still pale from witnessing the earlier events, stepped forward. For a brief second, his eyes met Adrian's, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, before he took Corbin by the arm. Corbin resisted at first, his mouth opening to protest, but Fisk cut him off with a sharp look. "This is not the time for your defense," the captain said curtly. "You'll have your chance to speak once we're on the ground." Corbin's protests withered into muttered complaints as Liam guided him down the aisle, the two disappearing toward the rear of the plane. A few passengers exhaled audibly, their tension easing just enough for the low murmur of conversation to resume. But the divide in the cabin was visible. Some eyes followed Adrian with quiet support, while others lingered on him warily, their uncertainty fed by Corbin's earlier accusations. Captain Fisk straightened, stepping closer to the intercom. The static crackled briefly before his voice filled the cabin, steady and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are diverting to the nearest major airport under emergency protocol. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions. We will provide updates as soon as possible." The announcement drew immediate whispers from passengers, some leaning across aisles to exchange thoughts, others simply staring ahead, trying to process the sudden change in their journey. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft began to alter its course, a subtle bank tilting the view through the windows. Adrian adjusted Kyle slightly, feeling the child's small pained breaths against his chest. Dane stepped back into place beside him, his presence steady, his eyes scanning the aisle for any sign of further trouble. Across the cabin, the businessman who had been recording earlier met Adrian's gaze and gave a barely perceptible nod, as if to say the truth was safe. Fisk glanced once more at Adrian, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, passing over his otherwise impassive face. Then he returned to the cockpit without another word, the door sealing shut with a final, weighted click. Passengers began murmuring again, some voices carrying sympathy, others laced with doubt, but none louder than the steady hum of the engines carrying them toward an unplanned destination. The flight had turned from quiet travel to a courtroom in the sky. Adrian kept his eyes fixed on the narrow aisle ahead, every muscle in his body tense as the cabin lights dimmed for landing. Cale shifted faintly in his arms, the baby's face pale from exhaustion and pain, his arm immobilized in a makeshift splint that the onboard doctor had fashioned from a tongue depressor and gauze. The faint hum of the engines vibrated through Adrian's seat, a low reminder that their descent had begun. Across the aisle, Dane sat forward with one hand wrapped tightly around his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as he fielded calls from Adrian's legal team. The tone of Dane's voice was clipped and low, the kind of tone that told Adrian every second mattered. The soft chime of the cabin intercom was followed by Liam's approach. The younger crew member moved with deliberate calm, but the dart of his eyes toward the forward galley betrayed the weight of what he carried. He crouched slightly beside Adrian, his voice a hushed thread over the dull murmur of passengers settling for landing. "He's secure," Liam said, glancing at Cale before leaning closer. "Corbin's restrained and under watch." Adrian's jaw tightened. He could picture Corbin sitting in the galley, restrained yet undoubtedly scheming, his mind already turning over ways to twist the narrative. Before Adrian could respond, Liam's next words shifted the air between them. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping further. "Corbin. He's not just another attendant. He's the cousin of Meridian Vista's Deputy Operations Director, Garen Vatch." The name landed like a stone in Adrian's stomach. Vatch's reputation was well known in corporate circles. A man skilled at erasing misconduct from the record, someone who could take the clearest evidence of wrongdoing and smother it beneath official statements and legal obfuscation. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the implication. If Vatch got involved, the fight ahead wouldn't just be about one violent attendant, it would be about dismantling an entire shield of protection that had likely hidden incidents like this for years. Dane's head turned sharply at the mention of Vatch's name. "That's the one who buried the Carthos security assault case last year," he muttered, his voice edged with quiet anger. He set the phone down on his knee and leaned in. "If Vatch is behind him, then we're not just dealing with damage control. They'll move fast. They'll try to discredit you before we even touch the ground." Adrian adjusted Cale gently in his arms, his gaze moving past Liam to the front of the cabin where the cockpit door remained shut. Outside the windows, the sky was shifting to a muted gold as the plane dipped lower, but the beauty of the descent felt like a cruel contrast to the storm tightening around him. He knew Dane was right. The airline wouldn't wait to hear his side, they would act, and their first step would be to flip the story entirely. "They'll try to flip the story," Dane said, leaning close enough that only Adrian could hear, his eyes steady and certain, "but we'll make sure the truth lands first." The landing gear slammed into the tarmac with a jarring thud, the cabin jolting as the engines roared in reverse thrust. The sudden deceleration pressed everyone into their seats, but the tension in the air was far heavier than the force of landing. Through the small oval windows, the glow of flashing amber lights cut across the dim cabin. Ground security vehicles closed in from both sides, their shapes distorted by the rain-speckled glass. The hum of the engines began to fade, replaced by the muffled crackle of radios outside. Adrian sat rigid, Cale cradled tightly in his arms. The baby's small face pressed into his father's chest, his tiny arm wrapped in a makeshift splint. Adrian's jaw was set, his eyes fixed forward, yet every muscle in his body was tuned to the slightest movement around him. Dane stood just ahead, blocking the narrow aisle with a deliberate stance, one hand resting on the back of Adrian's seat, the other gripping the strap of his bag. His presence was a silent barrier. No one would get close without going through him. Captain Durand Fisk appeared from the cockpit, his tall frame filling the aisle. His voice cut through the murmurs, firm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain in your seats. Law enforcement will board before anyone is permitted to disembark." His tone left no room for argument, and the rustling of passengers settling back in their seats was the only response. The forward door hissed open. 2 uniformed officers stepped aboard, their boots thudding against the jet bridge's rubber matting. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as they approached. Corbin, seated near the galley and clutching his neck with one hand, sprang to his feet before they reached him. His voice was strained yet loud enough to carry down the aisle. "That's him!" he barked, pointing a trembling finger toward Adrian. "He attacked me without cause. I need immediate medical attention." His words cracked against the stillness, but his eyes, sharp and darting, betrayed something beyond pain. Adrian didn't move, his gaze locked on the approaching officers, though he caught the subtle tightening of Dane's grip on the seat ahead. One officer began to turn toward Adrian, but a voice rose from the middle rows, steady and clear. "I have the entire thing on video," the businessman said, standing slowly. He was a tall man in a dark blazer, his phone held firmly in both hands. "From the moment the seatbelt was touched to when that baby screamed." He glanced briefly at Cale, then back to the officers. One officer hesitated. "You're certain?" The businessman didn't answer with words at first. Instead, he tapped his phone's screen, and the image came alive in the dim cabin light. There it was, frozen mid-frame, the shot of Corbin twisting the belt around Cale's fragile arm. The tiny limb bent unnaturally, skin pinched against metal, a thin streak of blood glistening against the pale fabric of his sleeve. Gasps rippled through the nearest passengers as they caught sight of it. Corbin's expression faltered, the rehearsed indignation slipping from his features. He tried to speak, his tone shifting to something softer, but it came out uneven. It was turbulence. I didn't." The businessman cut him off with a single sentence, his voice edged with quiet authority. "The footage doesn't lie." The officers exchanged a glance. Their posture changed, no longer angled toward Adrian, but toward Corbin. One stepped closer to the attendant, his voice lower now. "Sir, we'll need you to step aside." From his seat, Adrian felt the first ripple of momentum shifting in his favor, but he kept his expression controlled. The cabin remained tense. Yet there was a subtle shift in the air, as though the collective weight of suspicion had tilted toward the man in the galley. Dane glanced back at Adrian, the faintest nod passing between them. Outside, the rain streaked faster down the glass as the ground crew secured the aircraft. Inside, the scene had transformed into a silent standoff, officers positioned between truth and fabrication, a child's muffled breathing against his father's chest serving as the quiet center of it all. Corbin's shoulders dropped slightly, his eyes avoiding the glowing rectangle of the phone that had just dismantled his story. In that frozen moment, the lie began to collapse. Adrian and Dane were escorted quickly through a narrow service corridor, their footsteps echoing off the pale, sterile walls. The two uniformed officers guiding them moved with a brisk, unspoken urgency, glancing over their shoulders more than once. Inside the small private holding room, the air was cooler, the hum of the terminal muted behind the thick glass. A single table sat in the center, flanked by two plain chairs, and a wall-mounted clock ticked with unnerving precision. Adrian placed Cale gently in the crook of his arm, keeping the baby's injured limb supported against his chest. The rhythmic ticking seemed to grow louder, matching the measured beat of his restrained anger. Through the glass partition, movement caught Adrian's attention. In the adjoining hallway, Corbin was being led away by two stern-faced security officials. His gait was slower than before, his posture tense, but it was the third man who made Adrian's breath tighten. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark-tailored coat and carrying himself with the practiced confidence of someone used to controlling situations, Terrace Vaughan walked alongside them. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to confirm Dane's suspicion. Vaughan wasn't airport security, he was the airline's fixer, the man called when problems weren't meant to be solved, but buried. Dane's eyes narrowed, following Vaughan's every step. "That's him," he murmured, leaning closer to Adrian. "Terrace Vaughan, upper management's cleanup man." His voice was low, deliberate, as if speaking too loudly might draw Vaughan's attention through the glass. The unspoken truth between them was immediate and heavy. The airline had no intention of cooperating. This wasn't going to be a routine investigation, it was going to be a fight. Without wasting time, Dane set his bag on the table and pulled out his laptop. The familiar chime of the device starting up broke the silence. His fingers moved quickly across the keys, opening secure transfer protocols while his other hand retrieved a portable hard drive from his jacket pocket. He connected it with a quiet click and began duplicating every piece of video and photographic evidence they had. Each file was labeled with precision, timestamps, witness angles, even Cale's medical images. The loading bars crept forward, and with each completed transfer, Dane routed copies to 3 separate cloud servers, each hidden behind layers of encryption. "Cloud backups, Liv," Dane said without looking up, his tone firm. He then selected a handful of the most damning clips, the seatbelt twisting, Cale's cry, the visible blood on the infant's arm, and sent them to their Vandal City contact. The message was short but coded, the kind of communication they had refined over years of high-stakes business dealings. Adrian watched him work, a sharp pride tempered by the knowledge that this was only the first move in what would be a long campaign. A soft knock at the door shifted the room's focus. A medical team stepped in, 2 men in pale blue uniforms, one carrying a compact kit. The older of the two crouched beside Adrian, his voice calm but precise. "We'll need to set the arm temporarily before transport," he explained. Adrian nodded silently, his eyes never leaving Cale's face as the man's gentle hands examined the injury. The baby whimpered at first, but the careful pressure and soft voice began to quiet him. A fresh bandage was wrapped, a small splint secured. Cale's breathing slowed, his eyelids fluttering as exhaustion overcame the pain. For a moment, the sound of Cale's soft breaths was the only thing in the room. Adrian brushed his son's cheek with his thumb, his jaw tightening. The tenderness of the moment only sharpened the steel forming in his mind. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was planning. Each decision from here on would be deliberate, calculated to counter the airline's inevitable attempts to twist the truth. Across the glass, Vaughan glanced in briefly before turning away, his conversation with the security officials hidden by the distance. The look was fleeting, but it carried a message, a warning that this was far from over. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, feeling the weight of that challenge. He had faced corporate boardrooms, political negotiations, and high-stakes contracts, but this was different. This was personal, and there was no margin for error. Dane closed the laptop with a quiet snap. "First wave's out," he said, his tone carrying both relief and anticipation. "Even if they try to erase everything, the truth's already moving." Adrian nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the door, already anticipating the next move. This was no longer about one violent man on a plane, it was about the machinery behind him, the system that allowed it to happen. He straightened his shoulders, Cale safe in his arms, and felt the shift in himself. This wasn't just a father protecting his child, this was a strategist bracing for siege, ready to take the fight from the sealed cabin of a jet into the corridors of power. The battle line had been drawn, and Adrian had no intention of stepping back. The real battle wasn't in the air, it was about to begin on the ground. Within hours, news of the incident leaked online. First a shaky clip from row 11, then a sharper angle from near the bulkhead, and finally the full recording from the businessman who had filmed everything. The airport's private room, with its dull fluorescent lights and humming air vent, became a war room. Adrian stood by the window, staring at the runway lights blinking like warnings in the dusk, while Dane sat at the table with 2 laptops open watching the view counts surge. The clips spread across platforms in waves, each crest pulling in more witnesses who posted slivers of what they had seen. Comments flooded in, some outraged, some skeptical, all demanding answers. The sound of Cale's cry in the videos, raw, sharp, impossible to ignore, cut through the noise of the internet and made strangers lean closer to their screens. Then the airline's statement dropped. Dane refreshed the page and read it aloud with a cool, steady voice that belied the tension in his shoulders. A misunderstanding involving heightened tensions during turbulence. He exhaled through his nose and set the laptop down, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Adrian didn't move from the window. His reflection looked older in the glass, heavier with the day, but his eyes were clear. "They want it simple," he said softly, hands clasped behind his back. "They want people to be tired by morning." He turned from the glass. "We don't let them." Dane already had the counter in motion. He slid a drive from his pocket and plugged it into the second laptop, a mirrored backup of the businessman's complete footage, time-stamped and watermarked. "3 contacts," he said, tapping 3 names on a list. Eshan Tram, Marlo Venk, John Cade. All were independent, all were known for refusing easy narratives, all were men who had taken on bigger targets and kept going. They get exclusives, not just the clip, the chain of custody, the context, the captain's diversion call, the medical assessment, clean and chronological. Adrian nodded once. "No commentary," he said. "Just the truth." Dane understood. Truth did not need color when the bruise was already visible. The first calls were brief. Eshan picked up on the first ring, his voice quiet, cautious, already taking notes. He asked for verification, timestamps, 2-factor confirmation from the businessman who filmed, and approval to use the captain's diversion announcement. Dane provided each calmly, his tone even, his posture upright, the rhythm of his breathing matched to the steady blinking cursor on the screen. Marlo sent a message confirming he would go live in 20 minutes with a short preface and the full clip. John asked for one thing more. "Tell me if you're safe." The room went still for a moment. Adrian glanced to the hallway where 2 uniformed officers stood guard behind the frosted glass. "We're safe," Adrian said, taking the phone and speaking with a measured steadiness that made the words sound like a promise. "We will remain safe because we are not alone." The statement from the airline began to trend anyway, buoyed by anonymous accounts repeating the same lines. The pattern was familiar, a wall of sameness intended to smother nuance. Dane tracked the posts across a dashboard, reused phrasing, synchronized timing, sudden bursts at the top of each hour. "It's coordinated," he said, tapping a cluster of identical sentences on the screen. "Someone's paying for a narrative." Adrian didn't look surprised. "Then we provide the one that does not need purchase." He sat, finally, settling in across from Dane, rolling his shoulders once to release the ache. "Send the chain of custody document to all 3, he added. "Make sure the metadata is front and center." The businessman responded to Dane's verification request within minutes, his message short but steady. He would sign an affidavit and appear on a live call if needed. His name appeared on the screen for the first time. Harlan Kitt. Adrian repeated it once under his breath, honoring the resolve behind it. He didn't hesitate, Adrian said. He wanted to be seen as a witness, not an echo. Dane filed the affidavit template and sent an encrypted link. The clock on the wall clicked to the next minute, The sound clean and absolute, and a new wave of messages poured in. Some were blessings, short and simple. We stand with you. Stay the course. Justice will come. Some were colder. Settle and move on. You are making this bigger than it is. Think of your child. Then came the ones meant to make hands shake, a threat hinted behind a vague phrase, a warning dressed like advice, a countdown that ended with an ellipsis. Adrian's phone pulsed on the table. He read one, then turned the screen so Dane could see. Evidence evaporates when attention fades. Make your peace. The number was masked, the signature blank. Dane's eyes sharpened. He copied the message into a blank file and began stripping it down, headers, routing, any invisible crumbs left by a careless sender. Someone thinks we'll scare easily, Adrian said. His tone was as calm as when he presented to boardrooms, but his fingers pressed together until the knuckles paled. Someone thinks we've come this far without planning for fear. He watched Dane work, the cursor flashing, the code-like characters unfolding into a map of silent decisions. Dane's expression did not change, but his posture did. He leaned closer, as if scenting something beneath the surface. "There's a redirect," he murmured. The text pulled a tiny image, a pixel tracker hosted off-site. Whoever sent this wants to know if you opened it. Adrian moved the phone away from the laptops. "And did we tell them?" Dane shook his head. "Not yet. I captured it before it called home." He rose, paced once, then returned with a second cable, connecting the laptop to a hardened drive. "Let's see who expected you to be curious." He called up the tracker's path, traced the jump through a content delivery node, and found an origin address that did not belong to a public service. "Private block," he said. "Corporate allocation." He copied the numbers into a registry search and waited. The result appeared in a narrow window, stark and specific. A leased server registered through a shell company that Dane had seen before on a list of vendors hired to conduct reputation risk mitigation. The parent account's contact email was a short string at a familiar domain. Adrian read the domain aloud, each syllable clipped clean, maryvistalegal.net. He met Dane's eyes. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply nodded once as if a figure on a scan had finally gained edges. "So they watched," he said. "So they probed." The room seemed smaller for a heartbeat, the air denser. Outside the frosted glass, one of the officers shifted his weight and checked his watch. Inside, Dane took a screenshot of the registry result, saved it to 2 places, then printed the modest, unadorned page to paper. The printer hummed, slow and fussy, and the plain sheet slid out with a final click that sounded, to Adrian, like a door latch catching. "Next step?" Dane asked, though he already had 3 actions queued. Adrian answered without pause. "Mirror everything again, schedule releases at staggered times, send the tracker path to our contact in Vandell City and to the journalists with a note on its origin. And notify the captain's counsel that your footage is already in 3 hands that will not blink." Dane moved, fingers gliding. Across the city, Eshan posted an update with a line that landed like a gavel. "Full context below. No edits." Marlowe launched his stream with the raw clip and a measured timeline. John pinned the metadata sheet in his thread and wrote, "When stories are labeled misunderstandings, look for the paper trail." The airline statement continued to circulate, but the center of gravity shifted. The comments now asked why a tracker would be tied to a warning. They asked why an airline's legal department needed a shell company to host pixels. They asked, in quieter tones that carried farther, who advised the wording of misunderstanding, when a baby's cry could be measured in bone and blood. Adrian read none of it directly. He let Dane filter the noise into Signal. He picked up a pen and signed the affidavit Harlan had requested, the ink drying fast, sharp, decisive. His hand did not tremble. A new message arrived, shorter than the last. "You are being unwise." Dane did not reply. He took a photo of the screen with an offline camera and placed the device face down, then unplugged the laptops from the network and reconnected them through a different route. He set an alert for any attempt to call the pixel a second time from the original number. "If they try again," he said, "we'll have their timing mapped to their office hours." Adrian leaned back, shoulders finally easing, though his eyes remained focused as if scanning an invisible horizon only he could see. "Do you think they stop now?" Dane asked. Adrian's answer came quick, almost gentle. "Number people do not stop when they are afraid. They only change tools." He folded the signed page once and handed it to Dane. So, we changed tools faster. The hallway lights dimmed by a notch as the building shifted to evening settings. Outside, a late flight roared down the runway and lifted into the dark, a long, steady climb that left a tremor in the room's thin window. The phone chimed one last time that hour. It was Ishan sending a single line. Publishing full context with chain of custody now. Dane nodded and typed back a short acknowledgement. Adrian stood and returned to the window. The runway lights blinked in precise sequence, a choreography of guidance under night. He placed a palm against the glass, not to steady himself but to feel the cool certainty on the other side. In that moment, with the printer quiet, the laptops humming, and the guards a pale blur beyond the door, he understood the shape of the conflict. Not noise against noise, but a patient, methodical narrowing of what could be denied. He turned from the window and met Dane's eyes, knowing the next hours would bring a different kind of pressure. He welcomed it. The shadows around them were moving, but so was their plan. 2 days later, the heavy wooden doors of the Brenton Federal Courthouse swung open, and Adrian Holt stepped out of the black sedan waiting at the curb. The air outside was crisp, but the steps ahead radiated with heat from the dozens of camera lights trained on him. Flashbulbs burst in rapid succession, each one momentarily blinding, each shout from the reporters cutting through the low roar of the gathered crowd. Dane Merrick was right beside him, gripping a leather briefcase so tightly that the tendons in his hands stood out in sharp relief. The case contained the two things that could turn the trial in their favor: the unedited footage of Cale's injury and a set of internal Meridian Vista reports leaked only hours earlier. A narrow walkway had been cleared by federal marshals, their stoic expressions making them appear like part of the courthouse itself. As they guided Adrian toward the grand stone steps, a voice from the press pack shouted, "Mr. Holt, are you seeking prison time for Corbin Latch?" Another called, "Do you believe the airline was directly involved?" Adrian kept his gaze steady on the building ahead. He couldn't afford to give an off-the-cuff answer that might be twisted before the hearing even began. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. Quiet, thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint rustle of papers. The courtroom was already crowded, every seat in the gallery taken by a mixture of reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens drawn by the growing scandal. On the opposite side of the aisle, Meridian Vista's legal team sat in a tight cluster, their suits perfectly pressed, their expressions sharp and calculating. At the far end of the table, Corbin sat with a brace around his neck, avoiding Adrian's eyes, his jaw clenched. When the proceedings began, the airline's lead attorney wasted no time attempting to cast Adrian as an aggressor. His voice was smooth, measured, but his words were laced with insinuation, claims that Adrian had overreacted in a moment of turbulence, that he had misinterpreted the attendant's actions. As the attorney spoke, Adrian felt the muscles in his back tighten, but he kept his face composed. He knew the moment to counter would come, and it needed to be decisive. That moment arrived sooner than expected. Dane rose, setting the briefcase on the plaintiff's table with a deliberate thud before unlocking it. He withdrew a slim black folder and handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As the judge began flipping through the pages, the murmurs in the gallery grew louder. The documents were damning, records of multiple passenger injuries tied to Corbin over the last 3 years, each incident marked resolved, but without evidence of investigation. Adrian could see the judge's brow furrow, the weight of the information clearly registering. Then came the turning point. Liam Roche, summoned as a witness, stepped forward. His posture was rigid, his eyes darting briefly toward Corbin before settling on the judge. "I was warned by senior staff never to question Corbin's conduct," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "I was told his family connections meant crossing him could end my career." His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. Even Meridian Vista's attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. Over the next hour, more testimony followed, passengers recounting what they saw, the businessman presenting his full recording of the incident, the audio capturing the moment Cale's arm was broken and the coldness in Corbin's voice as he claimed it was an accident. Each piece of evidence was like a stone placed on the scale, tilting it steadily toward the truth. When the judge finally recessed to deliberate, the courtroom was tense, the only sounds the shuffle of papers and the low hum of whispered speculation. Adrian sat still, hands clasped loosely in his lap, his mind fixed on Cale at home, safe but still healing. He thought of how easily the story could have been buried, how many others had likely faced the same cruelty without the chance to fight back. The judge returned less than an hour later, his expression grave but resolute. He spoke clearly, each word cutting through the silence. Corbin Latch would face criminal charges for his actions aboard Flight 824, and Meridian Vista Airlines would be placed under federal oversight, mandated to overhaul its training and accountability protocols. The decision struck the room like a sudden shift in air pressure, relief for some, shock for others. Adrian exhaled slowly, a quiet, measured breath. He didn't look toward Corbin or the airline's attorneys. His focus was already on what came next. As he rose from his seat, Dane leaned close and murmured, "We did it." Adrian nodded once, his expression unreadable, but inside he knew the victory was bigger than himself. Adrian had not only defended his son, he had changed the rules of the game. He broke a child's arm and paid the price in full. If you stand for protecting the vulnerable and punishing the guilty, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of negligence, unchecked power, and the rapid escalation of conflict under extreme stress. Its purpose is to raise awareness about the importance of safety, accountability, and responsible conduct in high-pressure environments, while provoking thought about the human cost of impulsive actions.